I stared at the foreclosure notice taped to our front door, the same red lettering that had haunted my dreams for months. In my previous life, this moment had destroyed everything: my college fund, my parents' retirement, our family home. But this time, I wasn't the naive 17-year-old who had watched helplessly as Marcus Chen systematically drained every penny from my trusting parents. This time, I remembered everything. The memory of my death was still fresh. The heart attack at 35, brought on by the stress of caring for my destitute, broken parents who never recovered from Marcus's betrayal. I had died knowing that if I'd just spoken up sooner, if I'd just been more convincing, I could have saved them. Now, somehow, impossibly, I had been given a second chance. I was 17 again, standing in our pristine suburban home that Marcus hadn't yet convinced my parents to mortgage for his investment opportunities. The familiar scent of my mother's lavender candles filled the air, and I could hear my father's booming laugh from the living room where he was entertaining his dear friend Marcus, the man who would ruin us all. But not this time. It had started so innocuously in my first life. Marcus Chen had been my father's college roommate, a charismatic businessman who had made it big in real estate development. When he reconnected with Dad at their 25th reunion, my parents were thrilled to rekindle the friendship. Marcus was everything they aspired to be: wealthy, confident, living in a mansion in the hills with a wife who looked like a magazine model. "David, you're wasting your potential in that accounting firm," Marcus had said during one of his frequent visits to our modest but comfortable home. "I'm telling you, there are opportunities out there that could set your family up for life." My father, David Morrison, had spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder at a mid-sized firm, earning a respectable but unremarkable living. My mother, Susan, worked part-time as a substitute teacher. They had saved diligently for my college fund and their retirement, living below their means and taking pride in their financial responsibility. They were good people, trusting, hardworking, and completely unprepared for a predator like Marcus. In my previous life, I had been a typical teenager, more concerned with my upcoming SATs and whether Jake Patterson would ask me to prom than with my parents' business discussions. I had liked Marcus well enough. He always brought expensive gifts and told funny stories about his travels. When my parents started talking about investment opportunities and passive income streams, I had tuned out, assuming they knew what they were doing. I learned too late that trust and intelligence are not the same thing. Marcus's scheme had been elaborate and patient. He started small, convincing my parents to invest $5,000 in a guaranteed real estate flip that returned $7,000 in just 3 months. When that paid off exactly as promised, he had their complete confidence. The next investment was $20,000, which also paid handsomely. By the time he suggested they mortgage the house to invest in his exclusive development project, my parents saw him as a financial genius who was generously sharing his secrets with old friends. The development project, of course, was a complete fabrication. Marcus had used their money, along with funds from dozens of other victims, to maintain his lavish lifestyle while running an elaborate Ponzi scheme. When it all collapsed, my parents lost everything: their home, their savings, their retirement fund, and my college money. The shame and stress destroyed their marriage within 2 years. Dad started drinking heavily and died of liver failure when I was 28. Mom lived longer but never recovered from the depression and anxiety that followed their financial ruin. I had spent my 20s working multiple jobs to support them, never able to afford college, watching them wither away from the trauma of being so thoroughly betrayed by someone they trusted. The stress of caring for them while struggling financially had literally killed me. A massive heart attack at 35, alone in a studio apartment I could barely afford. But somehow, I had awakened in my 17-year-old body 3 months before Marcus would make his first investment pitch to my parents. This time, I knew exactly what he was planning. This time, I could stop him. "Sweetheart, come meet Uncle Marcus," my mother called from the living room, using the honorary title she had bestowed on Dad's old friend. I walked in to find them exactly as I remembered. Dad in his favorite armchair, animated and excited. Mom perched on the edge of the sofa, hanging on every word. And Marcus, 42 years old, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences for his actions. He was handsome in a conventional way, with silver threading through his dark hair and an expensive watch catching the light as he gestured. There she is. Marcus stood up, flashing the $1,000,000 smile that had charmed so many victims. Emily, you've grown up so much since I last saw you. Your parents tell me you're applying to colleges soon? Yes, I said carefully, studying his face. It was surreal to look at someone who had destroyed my family while they had no idea what I knew. I'm hoping for Stanford or Berkeley. Excellent schools, very expensive though. He shared a meaningful look with my parents. But I'm sure your mom and dad have that all figured out, right, David? Dad's smile faltered slightly. Well, we've been saving, but these top-tier schools... Dad, can I talk to you and Mom privately for a minute? I interrupted. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but Dad waved me off. Emily, don't be rude. Marcus was just telling us about some exciting opportunities. That's exactly what I want to talk to you about, I said firmly. Please, it's important. My parents exchanged glances. They had always encouraged me to speak up when something was bothering me, a family value that was about to work in my favor. Of course, sweetheart, Mom said. Marcus, would you mind if we stepped into the kitchen for just a moment? Take your time, Marcus said smoothly, settling back into his chair. I'll just check some emails. I led my parents into the kitchen and closed the door behind us. This was it. My one chance to prevent the nightmare that had consumed my first life. I had to be careful. If I came across as a paranoid teenager, they would dismiss me. But I had information that could save them if only I could find the right way to present it. Mom, Dad, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I began. I think Marcus is going to try to scam you. Dad's face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally irritation. Emily, that's a terrible thing to say about an old friend. What would make you think something like that? I've been researching investment scams for a school project, I lied smoothly. And everything Marcus is saying fits the pattern perfectly. The talk about opportunities, the focus on how expensive college is, the way he's building up his own success, it's textbook. Honey, Mom said gently, I understand you're worried about college costs, but Marcus is a successful businessman. He's not trying to scam anyone. Then why won't he give you specific details about these opportunities? I pressed. Has he shown you actual contracts, business plans, regulatory filings? Or is it all just vague talk about passive income and exclusive deals? Dad frowned. Well, we haven't gotten into the specifics yet. Because there are no specifics, I said urgently. Dad, please. I'm not asking you to be rude to him or cut off the friendship. I'm just asking you to promise me that before you invest any money with Marcus, you'll do independent research. Talk to a financial advisor who doesn't know him. Check with the Better Business Bureau. Verify everything he tells you through official sources. My parents looked at each other uncertainly. I could see them wavering between trust in their friend and concern for their clearly worried daughter. Emily, Dad said slowly, did something happen that made you suspicious of Marcus specifically? Or is this just general anxiety about investment scams? This was the moment. I had to decide how much truth to reveal. I couldn't tell them about my previous life. They would think I was having a mental breakdown. But I needed to give them something concrete enough to take seriously. I saw him yesterday, I said, which was technically true, though it had been in my previous life. He was at that fancy restaurant downtown, the one that cost like $200 per person. But he was with a woman who definitely wasn't his wife, and they were looking at real estate brochures for properties in countries that don't have extradition treaties with the U.S. My parents stared at me. Emily, are you sure? Mom asked. I'm sure, I said firmly. And when I got curious and looked him up online, I found some concerning things. There are questions about some of his previous business dealings, complaints that were settled out of court. Nothing proven, but enough to make me worried. Actually, in my previous life, it had taken investigators months after the collapse to piece together Marcus's history of questionable deals. But I knew they would find those breadcrumbs if they looked. Dad was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said finally. I hear what you're saying, and you're right that we should always do our due diligence before making any major financial decisions. We'll be careful. Promise me, I insisted. Promise me you won't give him any money without checking everything first. We promise, Mom said, putting her arm around me. You're a smart girl, Emily. We'll take your concerns seriously. I felt a surge of relief, but I knew this was just the beginning. Marcus was skilled at overcoming objections, and my parents were still predisposed to trust him. I had planted seeds of doubt, but I would need to nurture them carefully to prevent Marcus from getting his hooks into my family. We returned to the living room where Marcus was scrolling through his phone with the casual confidence of a man who had never doubted his ability to manipulate others. Sorry about that, Dad said as we sat back down. Emily had some questions about college planning. Of course, Marcus smiled. It's smart to start thinking about these things early. Actually, that's perfect timing, because I was about to tell you about an opportunity that could help with exactly that problem. I watched my parents' faces carefully as Marcus launched into his pitch. It was exactly as I remembered. The casual mention of a small real estate flip that could earn a modest but guaranteed return. The emphasis on how the profits could go straight into my college fund. The implication that he was doing them a favor by sharing this exclusive opportunity. It's really quite simple, Marcus was saying. I buy properties that need minor cosmetic work, invest a few thousand in improvements, and flip them within 90 days. The returns are typically between 30 and 50%. That sounds almost too good to be true, Dad said, and I felt a flicker of hope that my warnings had taken root. Marcus laughed. I know it sounds that way, but real estate is all about timing and relationships. I have contractors who work for below market rates because I give them consistent business, and I have buyers who trust me to find them quality properties. It's a well-oiled machine. What kind of properties are we talking about? Mom asked. Mostly single-family homes in up-and-coming neighborhoods. Nothing fancy, just solid investment properties. For example, I just closed on a 3-bedroom ranch in Oakdale that I picked up for $60,000. I'll put $8,000 into updates, new flooring, fresh paint, modern fixtures, and sell it for $95,000 within 2 months. I had to admire his performance. The numbers were specific enough to sound real, but vague enough to be unverifiable. The timeline was short enough to seem exciting, but long enough to seem realistic. He was very good at what he did. That does sound interesting, Dad said cautiously. But Emily just had a good point about doing our due diligence before making any investment decisions. Marcus's smile didn't waver, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Absolutely. I would never expect anyone to invest without doing their homework. In fact, I insist on it. I can provide references from previous investors, documentation on past projects, whatever you need to feel comfortable. That would be great, I said before my parents could respond. Could you give us contact information for 3 of your previous investors, along with documentation showing the properties you flipped for them and the exact returns they received? Marcus looked at me with new attention, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Of course, he said smoothly. I'll put together a packet for your parents. And could you also provide the business licenses and regulatory filings for your real estate company? I continued, just so we can verify everything is legitimate. Emily, Dad said, sounding embarrassed. That's enough questions for now. But Marcus held up a hand. No, she's absolutely right to ask. Smart family you have here, David. Yes, I can provide all of that documentation. In fact, I appreciate dealing with people who ask the right questions. It shows me you'll be responsible partners. He was saying all the right things, but I could sense his irritation. In my previous life, my parents had been so eager to trust that they had never asked for any documentation. Marcus wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a teenager. Great, I said brightly. We'll wait for that packet before we make any decisions. Of course, Marcus said. I'll have everything to you by the end of the week. The rest of the visit proceeded normally, with Marcus sharing stories about his recent vacation to Tuscany and asking about my college plans. But I could feel the shift in dynamics. Where before he had been a charming family friend sharing an exciting opportunity, now he was a salesman whose pitch had been interrupted by inconvenient questions. After he left, my parents sat me down for what I expected to be a lecture about rudeness. Instead, Dad surprised me. You know what, Em? I'm proud of you for asking those questions. Even if Marcus is completely legitimate, it's good practice to verify everything before investing. I just don't want anything bad to happen to our family, I said honestly. Nothing bad is going to happen, Mom assured me. We'll wait for his documentation, verify everything, and then make a careful decision. But I knew Marcus wasn't going to provide real documentation because he couldn't. His previous investors were either fictional or fellow scammers. His business licenses were fake or expired. His whole operation was built on confidence and manipulation, not actual business activities. The question was, what would he do when he realized he couldn't fool my family as easily as he had expected? Marcus's first move was to try to bypass my parents entirely. 3 days after his visit, I came home from school to find him sitting in our kitchen with my mother, looking concerned and sympathetic. "Oh, Emily," he said when I walked in. "I was just telling your mom about a conversation I had with an old friend who's a child psychologist. He mentioned that sometimes teenagers develop anxiety about their family's financial security, especially when college is approaching. It can manifest as suspicion toward anyone who might change the status quo." I felt my blood pressure spike, but I forced myself to remain calm. "That's interesting. What did you tell your friend about my questions?" "Just that you seemed worried about your parents making investment decisions," Marcus said gently. He thought it might help if I explained my business in terms you could understand, maybe even showed you some of the properties I'm working on. Mom looked uncomfortable. "Marcus, I appreciate the thought, but Emily asked perfectly reasonable questions. She's not anxious. She's being responsible." "Of course," Marcus said quickly. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I just want her to feel comfortable with the family's financial decisions." It was a masterful manipulation. He was simultaneously dismissing my concerns as teenage anxiety while positioning himself as caring about my feelings. If I protested too strongly, I would look like I was proving his point about being anxious and irrational. "I'd be happy to see your documentation," I said evenly. "Did you bring that packet you promised?" "I'm still putting it together," Marcus said. "Some of the documents need to be requested from county offices, and you know how slow government bureaucracy can be. But I did bring something that might interest you." He pulled out his phone and showed us photos of a house that looked like it had been staged for a real estate listing. "This is the Oakdale property I mentioned. I closed on it yesterday." The photos showed a modest ranch house with dated but clean interiors. It looked exactly like what he had described, a property that would benefit from cosmetic updates. "It's nice," I said carefully. "Can you show us the purchase documents?" Marcus's smile flickered. "Those are confidential business documents, Emily. I can't share proprietary information about ongoing deals." "But you're asking my parents to invest in your business," I pointed out. "Wouldn't they need to see some examples of how these deals actually work?" "When they become actual investors, of course they'll have full transparency," Marcus said. "But I can't share detailed financial information with people who haven't committed to the partnership." It was a classic catch-22. Trust me enough to invest, and then I'll prove I'm trustworthy. But I could see doubt creeping into my mother's expression. "That makes sense from a business perspective," Mom said slowly, "but I can understand why Emily would want to see more details up front." Marcus seemed to recognize that his usual approach wasn't working. He switched tactics, leaning forward with an expression of earnest sincerity. "Look, I understand the caution. It's actually refreshing to meet a family that asks tough questions. Most people are so eager to make easy money that they don't do their homework. But let me ask you this. What if I offered a smaller initial investment? Something low risk that would let you see how the process works?" "How small?" Mom asked. $1,000, Marcus said. "I'll add it to my next flip and you'll see exactly how the returns work. When you get your profit back, you'll have concrete proof of how the business operates." It was exactly the same approach he had used in my previous life, just with a smaller initial amount to overcome their resistance. I had to shut this down immediately. "That's still $1,000 of our money based on nothing but your word," I said. "Why don't we wait until you can provide the documentation you promised? Then we can make an informed decision about any investment amount." Marcus's mask slipped slightly, and for just a moment, I saw irritation flash across his features. "Emily, I understand you're trying to protect your parents, but sometimes excessive caution can cost people real opportunities. The Oakdale flip is happening with or without your family's participation. Then it can happen without us, I said firmly. Mom looked between Marcus and me, clearly torn. Marcus, I think Emily has a point. Let's wait for the documentation and then revisit this conversation. Marcus stood up, his smile now strained. Of course, I'll have everything to you soon. He paused at the door. I just hope that by the time you're ready to move forward, the opportunity hasn't passed you by. After he left, Mom turned to me with a troubled expression. Emily, I know you're trying to protect us, but I'm starting to worry that you're being too suspicious. Marcus has been nothing but patient with your questions. Mom, did you notice that he couldn't provide a single piece of documentation? Not one reference, not one business license, not even a basic purchase contract for that house he claims to own? He said those things take time to obtain. From the county office, I pulled out my laptop. Let me show you something. I navigated to the county assessor's website and searched for recent property sales in Oakdale. Within 5 minutes, I had pulled up records for every property sold in the past month, complete with sale prices, buyer names, and transaction dates. Look, I said, showing her the screen. If Marcus really bought a house in Oakdale yesterday, it would show up here. What's his company's name? Mom hesitated. I don't think he ever mentioned a specific company name. Exactly, Mom, I'm not being paranoid. I'm asking basic questions that any legitimate businessman would be happy to answer. The fact that he can't or won't answer them is a huge red flag. Mom stared at the computer screen where no property sales matched Marcus's description. Maybe it hasn't been updated yet. Maybe, I agreed. But when he comes back with his documentation, we can check everything against public records. If he's legitimate, everything will match up perfectly. But I knew Marcus would never come back with real documentation because it didn't exist. The question was, what he would try next. The answer came 2 weeks later when Marcus showed up at our door on a Saturday morning looking harried and upset. Dad was working in the garage and I was helping Mom in the garden when we heard his car in the driveway. Susan, thank God you're home, Marcus said, practically stumbling out of his BMW. I need to talk to you and David right away. Mom wiped her hands on her gardening gloves, concerned by his obvious distress. What's wrong, Marcus? There's been a development with the Oakdale property, he said urgently. I've been trying to reach David all morning. Dad emerged from the garage, wiping grease off his hands. Marcus, what's going on? The property inspection turned up some unexpected issues, Marcus said, his words tumbling over each other. Foundation problems that weren't disclosed by the seller. My contractor says it's going to cost an additional $15,000 to fix. Money I don't have liquid right now because it's all tied up in other projects. I felt a chill of recognition. In my previous life, this had been Marcus's second approach when the straightforward investment pitch didn't work immediately. Create urgency, manufacture a crisis, and then position my parents as heroes who could save the day. That's terrible, Mom said sympathetically. What are you going to do? I have 2 options, Marcus said grimly. I can walk away from the deal and lose the down payment I already put down, or I can find short-term financing to cover the repairs. The problem is, banks won't approve a loan quickly enough, and the seller is giving me 72 hours to either close or forfeit my deposit. How much is the deposit? Dad asked. $25,000, Marcus said. Money I'll lose completely if I can't close. Dad whistled low. That's a lot of money to lose. It gets worse, Marcus continued. This was supposed to be a quick flip that would generate seed money for 3 other properties I have under contract. If I lose this deal, I'll have to walk away from those opportunities too. We're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands in lost profits. I watched my parents' faces and saw exactly what Marcus was counting on. Good-hearted people who hated to see a friend in trouble. In my previous life, they had immediately offered to help, seeing it as a chance to both save their friend and get in on a profitable deal. Marcus, I'm so sorry, Mom said. Is there anything we can do to help? Actually, Marcus said, as if the thought had just occurred to him, there is. If you could lend me the $15,000 for the foundation repairs, I could close on the property and flip it as planned. I'd pay you back within 90 days, plus 50% interest for the short-term loan. 50%? Dad repeated, clearly surprised by the generous terms. It's the least I can do, Marcus said earnestly. You'd be saving my entire business plan, and frankly, you'd be getting a better return than any bank could offer. I had to admire his technique. He had created an emotional story that made my parents feel needed and important, while simultaneously offering them terms that seemed too good to pass up. The time pressure added urgency that would prevent them from thinking too carefully about the details, but this time, I was ready for him. Marcus, I said quietly, could I see the inspection report that found these foundation problems? He looked at me with poorly concealed irritation. Emily, this isn't the time for— It's exactly the time, I interrupted. If my parents are going to lend you $15,000, they should see documentation of why you need it. The inspection report is at my office, Marcus said impatiently. I don't carry construction documents around with me. What's the name of the inspection company? I asked. And the contractor who gave you the $15,000 estimate? Marcus's jaw tightened. I don't see how those details are relevant. They're relevant because my parents need to verify that this is a real situation before they risk their savings, I said firmly. If everything is legitimate, you should be happy to provide that information. Emily, Dad said uncomfortably, Marcus is clearly under a lot of stress right now. Which is exactly when people make bad financial decisions, I said. Dad, remember what we talked about? Independent verification of everything? I could see the conflict in my parents' faces. They wanted to help their friend, but my previous warnings had clearly made an impact. Marcus, Mom said carefully, Emily does have a point. If we're going to lend you money, we should probably see some documentation. Marcus's expression hardened. Fine. You know what? Forget it. I thought I could count on old friends, but apparently your daughter has poisoned you against me. He stood up abruptly. I'll figure something else out. It was a classic manipulation tactic. Make them feel guilty for being cautious, then storm off to make them chase after him with the money. In my previous life, it had worked perfectly. But I had seen this performance before. Wait, I said as Marcus headed for the door. Before you go, could you just give us the address of the Oakdale property? We'd like to drive by and take a look. Marcus stopped dead. What? The property, I repeated innocently. If it's going to be such a great investment, we'd love to see it. What's the address? For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. I could practically see him calculating. If he gave us an address, we would drive there and discover that he didn't own any property. If he refused, it would confirm our suspicions. The deal is confidential until closing, he said finally. I can't disclose the address to non-investors. But you just asked us to become investors, Dad pointed out, sounding puzzled. Marcus's composure was beginning to crack. Look, David, either you trust me or you don't. I've been your friend for 25 years. I thought that counted for something. It does count, Dad said earnestly. But Emily raised some good points about being careful with investments and— Your daughter, Marcus said coldly, is a paranoid teenager who's sabotaging a legitimate business opportunity because she doesn't understand how the real world works. The attack on me was a mistake. I saw my parents' expressions immediately shift from uncertainty to protective anger. Don't talk about my daughter that way, Dad said sharply. She asked reasonable questions that you haven't been able to answer. Because you won't let me, Marcus snapped. Every time I try to explain something, she interrupts with more demands for documentation. It's like being interrogated by the FBI. Maybe because your story doesn't add up, I said calmly. A property you bought 2 weeks ago suddenly has a foundation problem that wasn't disclosed, requiring exactly the amount of money you originally wanted my parents to invest with terms that happen to be incredibly generous. It's either an amazing coincidence or a complete lie. Marcus stared at me with undisguised fury. You little— He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but the damage was done. I think you should leave, Mom said coldly. Now. Marcus looked between my parents, clearly realizing he had overplayed his hand. Susan, David, I didn't mean— You meant exactly what you said, Dad replied. And Emily was right to be suspicious. A real friend wouldn't get angry about being asked to verify his claims. Marcus's mask finally dropped completely. Fine. But don't come crying to me when you're struggling to pay for Emily's college and you remember the opportunities you passed up. After he left, my parents sat in stunned silence for several minutes. I can't believe I almost fell for that, Dad said finally. We both almost fell for it, Mom corrected. If Emily hadn't asked those questions, you would have lost $15,000 to start with, I said, and then more and more until he had taken everything. Dad pulled me into a hug. How did you know? I told you, I've been researching investment scams. Marcus hit every single warning sign. I paused, then decided to share one more piece of the truth. And when I looked him up online after his first visit, I found some concerning things. I didn't want to worry you without proof, but there are records of previous business partners filing complaints against him. This was true, though in my previous life, those records hadn't been discovered until after the FBI investigation. But I knew they existed, and if my parents looked hard enough, they would find them. We should report this to someone, Mom said. If he's trying to scam us, he's probably targeting other people too. I already called the Better Business Bureau and filed a complaint. I lied smoothly. They said they'd look into it. Actually, I had bigger plans for Marcus Chen. Saving my parents was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I watched Marcus's world begin to unravel from a distance. He had made a crucial mistake by losing his temper in front of my parents. It had revealed his true nature and destroyed the carefully cultivated image of a successful, benevolent friend. But more importantly, my parents' rejection had broken his timeline. In my previous life, the money from our family had been crucial to maintaining his lifestyle while he searched for bigger victims. Without that influx of cash, he was forced to take bigger risks with other marks. I helped that process along in small but significant ways. First, I created anonymous accounts on several social media platforms and began sharing warnings about investment scams, using details that closely matched Marcus's approach. I included specific language he had used: passive income streams, exclusive development projects, guaranteed returns, so that anyone who Googled those phrases would find my warnings. Second, I researched the public records for his previous business dealings and compiled a detailed timeline of his questionable activities. Then, I sent that information anonymously to the business reporter at our local newspaper, along with copies of complaints that had been filed against him in other states. Third, and most satisfyingly, I tracked down 3 of his current victims using the same public records searches I had taught my parents. These were people who had already given Marcus money and were waiting for their guaranteed returns. I sent them anonymous letters with copies of the newspaper article about his questionable business practices, along with contact information for the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I didn't have to wait long to see results. Within a month, Marcus's carefully constructed world began to collapse. It started with a newspaper article, "Local Businessman Under Investigation for Possible Investment Fraud." The reporter had done excellent work tracing Marcus's business activities across 3 states and interviewing several people who claimed he had taken their money under false pretenses. The article was devastating because it was factual and well-sourced. Marcus couldn't dismiss it as rumors or misunderstandings. There were documented patterns of behavior going back 15 years. Next came the complaints to law enforcement. The 3 victims I had contacted decided to file formal reports with both local police and the FBI. When investigators started looking into Marcus's activities, they discovered he had been running the same scam in multiple states, always moving on before the authorities could build a case against him. But this time, he had stayed in one place too long and accumulated too many victims. The investigation moved quickly once it began. Federal agents raided his office and home, seizing computers and financial records. What they found was evidence of a massive fraud scheme that had stolen millions of dollars from dozens of victims over the past decade. Marcus was arrested on a Tuesday morning at the coffee shop, where he often met with potential marks. I happened to be there with friends from school, ostensibly studying for finals, when the FBI agents walked in and handcuffed him in front of a room full of witnesses. Seeing him led away in handcuffs, looking confused and desperate as he tried to maintain his innocence, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was justice not just for what he had planned to do to my family, but for what he had actually done to us in my previous life. But the best part was still to come. The trial began 8 months later, and I convinced my parents to attend several days of testimony. I wanted them to see exactly what kind of man they had almost trusted with their life savings. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Victim after victim took the stand to describe how Marcus had charmed them, earned their trust, and then systematically drained their bank accounts. The pattern was always the same: initial small investments that paid off as promised, building trust for larger investments that disappeared into Marcus's personal accounts. One elderly couple testified that they had lost their entire retirement savings, $400,000, to Marcus's development project scam. They were now living with their adult children, having lost their home and their independence to his lies. A young father described how Marcus had convinced him to invest his daughter's college fund in a guaranteed real estate flip. When the flip turned out to be fictional, the man had been forced to take out loans against his home to pay for his daughter's education. Story after story of lives destroyed by Marcus's greed and manipulation. But the testimony that affected me most came from Patricia Chen, Marcus's own wife. Patricia took the stand as a prosecution witness, having been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation. She testified that she had discovered her husband's scheme 2 years earlier, but had been too frightened to report it. "He controlled everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our bank accounts, our social life, even what I was allowed to say to neighbors. When I found out what he was doing to those people, I threatened to go to the police. He said if I did, he would make sure I was charged as an accomplice, that I would go to prison and lose our children." She described living in luxury bought with stolen money, always afraid that the truth would come out, watching her husband charm new victims while knowing what fate awaited them. "I kept telling myself that maybe this time would be different," she said through tears. "Maybe this time he really did have a legitimate deal. But there were never any real investments. It was all just taking money from one person to pay another and using most of it to fund our lifestyle." Marcus's defense attorney tried to paint him as a legitimate businessman whose deals had simply gone bad, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The prosecution had traced money from dozens of victims directly into Marcus's personal accounts, where it was used to pay for cars, vacations, jewelry, and the mortgage on his mansion. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The judge sentenced Marcus to 25 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay restitution of over $8 million to his victims. I watched Marcus's face as the sentence was read. The charming mask had long since crumbled, replaced by the haggard features of a man who finally understood that his actions had consequences. He looked older, smaller somehow, as the bailiffs led him away to begin what would likely be the rest of his productive life behind bars. But even more satisfying than Marcus's downfall was watching my parents process what they had almost lost. "Emily," Dad said as we drove home from the courthouse, "I keep thinking about that day when he asked us for $15,000. If you hadn't been there." "We would have given it to him," Mom finished quietly. "And then more and more, until we lost everything like those other families." "How did you know?" Dad asked, not for the first time. "I mean, I understand being cautious about investments, but you seem to know specifically that he was dangerous." I had prepared for this question. "Remember I told you I saw him at that restaurant with another woman? Well, I got curious and did some research online. I found old news articles about previous business partners who had complained about him. Nothing definitive, but enough to make me worried. And then when he couldn't provide any documentation to back up his claims." "You saved our family," Mom said simply. "Our house, our retirement, your college fund, everything." The irony wasn't lost on me. In my previous life, I had been powerless to prevent our destruction because I hadn't known what Marcus was planning. This time, armed with foreknowledge, I had been able to protect not just my family, but dozens of other potential victims. But I wasn't finished yet. The restitution process revealed the full scope of Marcus's crimes, but it also revealed something else. Most of the stolen money was gone. Marcus had spent millions on his lavish lifestyle, and while authorities could seize his assets, the mansion, the cars, the jewelry, it wasn't nearly enough to compensate all his victims. This was where my business education from my previous life proved valuable. During the years I had spent working multiple jobs to support my ruined parents, I had taken night classes in accounting and finance, trying to understand how we had been so thoroughly deceived. I had learned about asset recovery, bankruptcy proceedings, and victim compensation funds. More importantly, I had learned about civil asset forfeiture and how to trace hidden assets. Working with some of the other victims' families, I helped to organize a comprehensive investigation into Marcus's finances. We hired a forensic accountant who specialized in fraud cases, using pooled resources from the victim families to fund the investigation. What we discovered was that Marcus had been far more sophisticated than the prosecutors had realized. He had hidden millions of dollars in offshore accounts, shell companies, and investments in his wife's name. The federal investigators had found the obvious assets, but Marcus had been preparing for the possibility of prosecution for years. Our forensic accountant traced a complex web of financial transactions that led to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg. Marcus had been systematically moving money offshore every time he completed a major scam, creating a nest egg that he could access even from prison. The discovery process took 18 months, but eventually we were able to locate over $6 million in hidden assets. Working with international law enforcement and banking authorities, we initiated proceedings to freeze and recover those funds. Marcus fought the asset recovery from prison, claiming the offshore accounts belonged to legitimate business ventures. But our forensic evidence showed clear patterns of money movement that coincided exactly with his fraudulent activities in the United States. The legal battle was complex and expensive, but ultimately successful. The recovered funds, combined with the proceeds from selling Marcus's seized assets, provided substantial restitution to his victims. Most families recovered 60 to 70% of their losses, not complete compensation, but enough to rebuild their lives. For the elderly couple who had lost their retirement savings, it meant they could afford a small apartment and maintain their independence. For the father who had lost his daughter's college fund, it meant she could attend her dream school without crushing debt. And for my family, it meant something even more valuable: the knowledge that we had helped bring justice to a man who had destroyed so many lives. 2 years after Marcus's conviction, I was a sophomore at Stanford University. My college education funded by the savings my parents had protected through careful financial planning and the wisdom to listen to their teenage daughter's concerns. My parents had become minor celebrities in our community, frequently asked to speak at investment clubs and senior centers about how to avoid financial scams. They always credited me with saving them, but I knew the truth was more complex. They had raised me to think critically and speak up when something seemed wrong. When the moment came, they had been wise enough to listen. I was majoring in criminal justice with a focus on financial crimes, planning to become a federal investigator who could help protect other families from predators like Marcus. My previous life's experience with being a victim had given me insights that would make me a more effective prosecutor. But I also carried the weight of knowledge that I couldn't share with anyone. I knew things about financial crimes, about how scammers operated, that came from living through victimization in a previous life. I had to be careful not to seem too knowledgeable about techniques and patterns that I shouldn't have been able to recognize at 17. Sometimes I wondered about the metaphysics of my situation. Had I really been reborn? Or was this an elaborate fantasy constructed by a dying brain? Did it matter as long as the result was justice and protection for innocent people? I had decided it didn't matter. Whatever force had given me the chance to change my family's fate had also given me the opportunity to help many other families avoid the same tragedy. Whether it was divine intervention, quantum mechanics, or pure luck, I was grateful for the chance to turn knowledge of suffering into the power to prevent it. Marcus Chen remained in federal prison, where he would stay for at least 20 more years. His wife Patricia had divorced him, moved across the country with their children, and changed their names. She had used her portion of the recovered assets to start a non-profit organization that educated people about investment fraud. The house where I had died in my previous life, stressed, broke, and exhausted from caring for parents who never recovered from Marcus's betrayal, now belonged to a happy family with young children. My parents lived comfortably in the same home they had almost lost, their retirement secure, and their relationship stronger than ever. And I lived with the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the universe gives you exactly the chance you need to make things right. During my junior year at Stanford, I received an unexpected phone call from Detective Sarah Martinez, the federal agent who had led the investigation into Marcus's crimes. "Emily," she said, "I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. I got your number from your parents." "Not at all," I replied, curious about why an FBI agent would be contacting me 3 years after the case had closed. "I'm working on a new case that has some similarities to the Marcus Chen investigation," she explained. "Multiple victims, sophisticated financial fraud, a perpetrator who's very good at manipulating people's trust. I was wondering if you might be willing to consult with our team." "Consult how?" I asked. "Your insights during the Chen case were remarkable," Detective Martinez said. "You spotted patterns and red flags that even our experienced investigators initially missed. You seem to understand how these predators operate on an intuitive level that went beyond your research." I felt a chill of recognition. "What kind of case is it?" "A man named Robert Steinberg has been targeting wealthy widows in retirement communities across 3 states. He presents himself as a financial advisor and gradually gains access to their assets. The pattern is similar to Chen's, but more focused and arguably more cruel, because he's specifically targeting vulnerable elderly women who have recently lost their husbands." My blood ran cold. Robert Steinberg. In my previous life, after my father died and my mother had fallen into depression, she had been approached by a man matching that exact description. He had convinced her to give him power of attorney over her remaining assets, supposedly to help manage her affairs during her difficult time. Within 6 months, he had cleaned out her bank accounts and disappeared, leaving her with nothing. She had been too ashamed and confused to report it to the police, and she had died still blaming herself for being so stupid as to trust another charming stranger with her money. "I'd be very interested in helping," I told Detective Martinez. "When can we meet?" "Are you sure? This would mean getting involved in an active federal investigation. It could be dangerous if Steinberg realizes you're helping us." I thought about my mother in that previous life, broken and impoverished in her final years, dying with the shame of being victimized twice by financial predators. "I'm sure," I said firmly. "When do we start?" Working with the FBI on the Steinberg case taught me that Marcus Chen had been small-time compared to some financial predators. Steinberg was more sophisticated, more patient, and arguably more psychologically destructive than Marcus had ever been. Where Marcus had targeted middle-class families with get-rich-quick schemes, Steinberg specifically sought out recently widowed women who were emotionally vulnerable and unfamiliar with managing finances. He would spend months building relationships with his victims, attending the same churches or community centers, volunteering for the same charities, becoming a trusted friend before ever mentioning money. His approach was diabolically patient. He would befriend a widow, offer emotional support during her grieving process, help with small tasks around her house, and gradually position himself as an indispensable part of her support system. Only after months of relationship building would he mention his background in financial planning and offer to help her organize her deceased husband's affairs. By the time he gained access to her finances, his victims trusted him completely. They signed powers of attorney willingly, grateful to have someone reliable handling the overwhelming complexity of estates and investments. Steinberg would then systematically drain their accounts while maintaining the facade of friendship and support. The cruelest part was that he continued the relationships even after stealing their money, often being the only person in his victims' lives as they faced poverty and confusion. Some of his victims died never knowing they had been robbed, believing instead that their husbands had left them far less money than they had thought. "We've identified at least 12 victims across 3 states," Detective Martinez explained during my first briefing. "Total losses are estimated at over $4 million, but Steinberg is careful, he never takes everything at once, and he structures the thefts to look like legitimate financial transactions." "How did you identify the pattern?" I asked. "One of his victims had an adult son who was a CPA," she replied. "When he reviewed his mother's finances after she died, he noticed irregularities and reported them. Once we started looking, we found similar cases in neighboring states." I studied the case files, feeling the familiar rage that came from seeing detailed documentation of predatory behavior. But this time, I had more than just knowledge from a previous life. I had federal resources and legal authority to act on that knowledge. "What's your plan?" I asked. "We need to catch him in the act with a new victim," Detective Martinez said. The problem is that his existing victims either don't realize they've been robbed, or they're too embarrassed to admit it. We need someone to go undercover. I understood immediately. You want me to pose as a potential victim? Not exactly, she said. You're too young to fit his target profile. But we think you could pose as the granddaughter of a potential victim, someone who's concerned about her grandmother's new friend but doesn't have enough evidence to do anything about it. It was a brilliant plan. I would be able to observe Steinberg's methods firsthand while helping to gather evidence for his prosecution. More importantly, I would be able to protect his next intended victim from experiencing what my mother had gone through in my previous life. The undercover operation required extensive preparation. The FBI created a complete identity for my fictional grandmother, Margaret Walsh, a 73-year-old widow who had recently moved to a retirement community in Arizona where Steinberg was known to be operating. Margaret's husband, Harold, had supposedly died 6 months earlier, leaving her with a comfortable but not extravagant estate of about $800,000 in savings and investments. She was portrayed as someone who had relied heavily on her husband for financial decisions and was now struggling to manage her affairs alone. I would be Jennifer Walsh, Margaret's concerned granddaughter who lived in California but visited regularly. My role was to be suspicious of any new friends or advisors my grandmother might meet, providing a reason for me to ask probing questions about Steinberg's background and methods. The real genius of the operation was that we found a retired FBI agent, Margaret, who was willing to play my grandmother. Agent Patricia Coleman was a 68-year-old former white-collar crime specialist who had been looking for a way to stay involved in law enforcement after her retirement. I've been investigating financial predators for 30 years, she told me during our first meeting. Men like Steinberg destroyed my own grandmother back in the 1980s. I'd love to help take this one down. Patricia was perfect for the role. She understood exactly how these scams worked, but she was also a naturally gifted actress who could convincingly portray a vulnerable widow. We spent weeks preparing, developing the details of Margaret and Harold's fictional life together, and practicing the dynamics of our grandmother-granddaughter relationship. The operation began with Patricia moving into the Sunset Manor retirement community, an upscale facility in Scottsdale, where Steinberg had been observed attending social events and volunteer activities. Within 2 weeks, he had introduced himself to her at a community book club meeting. He's exactly what you'd expect, Patricia reported during one of our weekly debriefings. Handsome for his age, impeccably dressed, charming, but not pushy. He asked thoughtful questions about the book we were discussing and mentioned that he had lost his own wife 2 years ago. Steinberg's approach was textbook perfect. He positioned himself as someone who understood Patricia's loss while being careful not to seem predatory or opportunistic. He offered friendship and companionship with no apparent ulterior motive. Today he helped me carry groceries to my apartment, Patricia reported after their third encounter. He didn't invite himself in, didn't ask personal questions, just carried the bags and left. If I didn't know what he was planning, I'd think he was genuinely kind. This was exactly how he had approached my mother in my previous life. The gradual building of trust, the small helpful gestures, the impression of a caring person who wanted nothing more than friendship. It was only after months of relationship building that he would begin to probe about financial matters, but I wasn't going to wait months to gather evidence. I had a better plan. My first visit to see my grandmother was scheduled for 3 weeks after Steinberg had first introduced himself to Patricia. I flew to Phoenix and checked into a hotel near Sunset Manor, then spent the day observing Steinberg from a distance. He was exactly as I remembered from my previous life. Distinguished-looking, well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested success and reliability. He attended the community's morning exercise class, joined Patricia and several other residents for lunch, and spent the afternoon playing bridge in the recreation room. To anyone watching, he looked like a typical retiree who had found a comfortable social group. There was nothing obviously predatory about his behavior, which was precisely what made him so effective. That evening, I had dinner with Patricia in the community dining room, making sure Steinberg could observe our interaction. I played the role of a concerned granddaughter who was worried about her grandmother's adjustment to her new living situation. "I just want to make sure you're being careful about new friendships," I said, speaking loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "There are people who target widows, you know." Patricia played her part perfectly, responding with gentle irritation at my overprotectiveness. Jennifer, dear, I'm perfectly capable of making my own friends. Everyone here has been lovely. I know, Grandma, but Dad asked me to keep an eye on things. He's worried about scammers who specifically target retirement communities. I saw Steinberg glance in our direction, clearly listening to our conversation. This was exactly what I wanted, to establish myself as a suspicious granddaughter who would be watching for any signs of financial manipulation. After dinner, Steinberg approached our table with the kind of casual friendliness that seemed completely natural. "Excuse me," he said to Patricia. "I couldn't help overhearing your granddaughter's concerns. I think it's wonderful that she's so protective of you." Patricia smiled warmly. "Jennifer worries too much. Robert, this is my granddaughter, Jennifer Walsh. Jennifer, this is Robert Steinberg, one of my new friends here." I shook his hand, studying his face carefully. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Steinberg. How long have you lived here?" "About 6 months," he replied smoothly. "I moved here after my wife passed away. Margaret has been very kind in helping me adjust to the community." "That's nice," I said neutrally. "What did you do before you retired?" "I was a financial advisor," Steinberg said, and I saw Patricia's eyes widen slightly with perfectly feigned surprise. "Nothing too exciting, just helping people plan for retirement. Though I suppose that's not really relevant anymore." It was a masterful introduction. He had revealed his professional background in a way that seemed incidental, while simultaneously suggesting that he was no longer interested in working. The implication was that any future financial advice would be purely friendly, not professional. "A financial advisor," I repeated, letting a note of suspicion creep into my voice. "That's interesting." Steinberg's smile didn't waver, but I caught a slight tightening around his eyes. "Is there something wrong with that profession?" "Not at all," I said quickly. "It's just that my father warned me to be careful about people who approach elderly relatives with financial advice. I'm sure you understand." "Of course," Steinberg said graciously. "Your father sounds like a wise man. There are unfortunately people who take advantage of seniors, and it's good that your grandmother has family looking out for her." He was handling my suspicion perfectly, agreeing with my concerns while positioning himself as someone who would never engage in such behavior. In my previous life, this kind of response had disarmed my mother's few remaining suspicions about his motives, but this time, I was ready for him. Over the next several visits, I developed a pattern of showing up unexpectedly to check on my grandmother, always asking pointed questions about her new friends and activities. Steinberg quickly learned that I was a constant presence in Patricia's life and that any attempt to isolate her or manipulate her would have to account for my interference. This created exactly the dynamic I wanted. Steinberg couldn't risk moving too quickly with Patricia because I was obviously watching for signs of manipulation. But he also couldn't simply abandon her and move on to an easier target because he had already invested significant time in building their relationship. The result was that he began making mistakes, small deviations from his usual careful approach that provided evidence of his true intentions. "He's getting frustrated," Patricia reported after 6 weeks of the operation. Today he made a comment about how overprotective families sometimes prevent seniors from making their own decisions about financial matters. "That's perfect," I replied. "He's starting to probe about whether you'd be willing to make financial decisions without your family's knowledge." "He also asked about Harold's life insurance policy," she continued. "Very casually, just wondering if I had everything sorted out with the insurance company. When I said it was complicated, he offered to look at the paperwork if I wanted a second opinion." This was exactly the opening Steinberg had used with my mother in my previous life. The offer to help with complicated insurance or investment paperwork was his standard way of gaining access to financial information. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I said I'd think about it," Patricia replied, "but I mentioned that you had been helping me with the paperwork when you visit." "Good. That should make him even more frustrated." But I wanted to do more than just frustrate Steinberg. I wanted to gather evidence that would put him away for the rest of his life. And I had an idea for how to do exactly that. The key to catching Steinberg was to create a situation where he would reveal his criminal intentions clearly enough to be recorded. This required careful planning and a bit of manipulation on my part. During my next visit, I had a deliberately loud argument with Patricia in the community dining room about her financial management. "Grandma, I found 3 different investment statements in your apartment. I said, making sure nearby residents could hear. Dad is going to be furious when he finds out you've been making financial decisions without consulting him. They're my investments, Jennifer, Patricia replied with convincing indignation. I don't need permission to manage my own money. But some of these investments don't make sense, I continued. This bond fund has terrible ratings, and this stock portfolio is way too risky for someone your age. Several residents, including Steinberg, were clearly listening to our conversation. I was painting a picture of a family conflict over financial control, exactly the kind of situation that predators like Steinberg loved to exploit. I think we should consolidate everything with one financial advisor, I said. Someone Dad and I can work with directly to make sure your investments are appropriate. I don't want to change everything again, Patricia protested. Harold and I worked with the same advisor for 20 years. I'm comfortable with how things are set up. But Harold isn't here anymore, I said, perhaps more harshly than necessary. You need professional help, and you need family oversight. I stormed out of the dining room, leaving Patricia looking upset and embarrassed. It was a cruel performance, but it served its purpose, establishing a clear family conflict that Steinberg could exploit. Sure enough, within an hour, Steinberg was knocking on Patricia's door with a cup of tea and a sympathetic ear. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Jennifer, he said gently. I hope you don't mind me saying, but she seemed rather harsh with you. Patricia, wearing a wire provided by the FBI, played her part perfectly. She means well, but she doesn't understand how overwhelming it is to manage everything alone. Harold always handled our finances, and now I'm supposed to make decisions about things I don't understand. That must be very difficult, Steinberg said sympathetically. And it sounds like your family wants to take control away from you entirely. Jennifer thinks I'm too old to make my own decisions, Patricia said with convincing bitterness. She wants me to turn everything over to some advisor who will report back to her and her father. This was exactly the opening Steinberg had been waiting for. A victim who felt betrayed by her family and was looking for an ally who would respect her autonomy. You know, Steinberg said carefully, I couldn't help but notice some of the investment statements you mentioned. If you ever wanted a second opinion, just between friends, I'd be happy to take a look. No charge, of course, just one neighbor helping another. And there it was, the first clear step toward financial manipulation, recorded on a wire in a federal investigation. Would you really? Patricia asked. I don't want to impose. It wouldn't be an imposition at all, Steinberg assured her. I spent 40 years helping people understand their investments. It would actually be nice to feel useful again. Over the next hour, Steinberg carefully extracted information about Patricia's fictional financial situation. He learned about the life insurance payout, the investment accounts, the certificates of deposit that were coming due. Most importantly, he learned that Patricia felt isolated from her family and overwhelmed by financial decisions. By the end of the conversation, he had positioned himself as her financial confidant and planted the seeds for future manipulation. I hope you don't mind me saying this, he said as he prepared to leave, but you seem like a very intelligent woman who's perfectly capable of making her own financial decisions. Don't let anyone, family or otherwise, make you feel like you're not competent to control your own money. It was a masterful manipulation, validating her independence while simultaneously undermining her trust in her family's motives. But every word had been recorded, and it was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to establish his pattern of targeting vulnerable seniors. The investigation continued for 3 more months, with Steinberg gradually escalating his involvement in Patricia's fictional financial affairs. The recordings captured him using all the classic manipulation techniques, isolating her from family input, questioning the competence of her existing financial advisors, and slowly gaining access to detailed information about her assets. The breakthrough came when Steinberg finally suggested that Patricia grant him power of attorney just as a backup, in case something happens and your family can't be reached immediately. It's really just a precaution, he explained during a conversation that was being recorded by multiple devices. If you had a medical emergency or needed someone to handle urgent financial matters, it would be helpful to have someone local who understands your situation. But wouldn't that upset Jennifer and her father? Patricia asked. They don't need to know about it unless it becomes necessary, Steinberg replied smoothly. This would just be a limited power of attorney for emergencies. you'd still control all your own financial decisions. It was a complete lie, of course. The power of attorney documents Steinberg provided were comprehensive, giving him complete control over Patricia's finances. But he presented them as limited emergency authorization, counting on her trust and her unfamiliarity with legal language to prevent her from reading the fine print. This was exactly how he had gained control of my mother's assets in my previous life. A limited power of attorney that was actually comprehensive, presented during a moment of emotional vulnerability when she wasn't thinking clearly about the legal implications. But this time, instead of an isolated widow with no one to protect her, Steinberg was dealing with an experienced FBI agent who was building a federal case against him. When Patricia signed the power of attorney documents with invisible ink that would disappear within 24 hours, Steinberg began the process of transferring her assets to accounts he controlled. Every transaction was monitored and recorded by federal agents. Within 2 weeks, Steinberg had stolen over $300,000 from Patricia's fictional accounts, using the same methods he had employed against his real victims. The money was immediately transferred to offshore accounts that matched the pattern investigators had identified in his previous crimes. It was more than enough evidence to secure convictions on multiple federal charges. The arrest was coordinated across 3 states simultaneously. While federal agents were taking Steinberg into custody at a Scottsdale coffee shop where he was meeting with another potential victim, additional teams were executing search warrants at his various residences and offices. I was allowed to observe Steinberg's arrest from a distance, and I felt the same deep satisfaction I had experienced when Marcus Chen was led away in handcuffs. Another predator who had destroyed innocent lives was finally facing justice. But unlike the Marcus Chen case, this investigation had been proactive rather than reactive. Instead of waiting for Steinberg to victimize dozens of people before building a case against him, we had caught him in the act of attempting to steal from his first victim in this particular location. The evidence was overwhelming. In addition to the recorded conversations and documented theft from Patricia's accounts, the search warrants yielded computers containing detailed profiles of potential victims, false identity documents, and records of previous thefts going back over a decade. Steinberg's operation was far more sophisticated than Marcus Chen's had been. He maintained multiple identities, operated in different states under different names, and had stolen millions of dollars from elderly victims across the country. But he had made the same fundamental mistake that all predators eventually make. He had underestimated his victims. He had assumed that Patricia was just another lonely widow who could be easily manipulated and isolated from her family. He had never considered the possibility that she might be a federal agent with 30 years of experience investigating financial crimes. Steinberg's trial began 18 months later, and I testified as both a witness to the undercover operation and an expert on elder financial abuse. My academic work at Stanford had focused on the psychology of financial predators, and I had published several papers on the methods used by criminals like Steinberg and Marcus Chen. The courtroom was packed with victims from Steinberg's previous crimes, many of them elderly women who had never fully understood how they had been robbed until the FBI investigation made the pattern clear. One of the most powerful moments came when Margaret Phillips, an 81-year-old widow from Nevada, testified about how Steinberg had stolen her life savings while posing as her financial advisor and friend. "He was so kind," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He helped me with my groceries, drove me to doctor's appointments, even attended my husband's memorial service. I trusted him completely. When he said he needed to move my money to protect it from market volatility, I signed whatever papers he put in front of me." Mrs. Phillips had lost over $600,000, her entire inheritance from her deceased husband, to Steinberg's lies. She was now living in subsidized housing, surviving on Social Security, having gone from comfortable retirement to poverty because she had trusted the wrong person. The worst part, she continued, wasn't losing the money. It was realizing that someone I considered a friend had been planning to rob me from the moment we met. Every kindness, every gesture of support was just part of his plan to steal from me. So, story after story of lives destroyed by Steinberg's calculated cruelty. But this time, unlike with Marcus Chen, the victims had the satisfaction of knowing their testimony was helping to put their tormentor away for the rest of his life. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 37 counts of fraud, elder abuse, and money laundering. The judge sentenced Steinberg to 45 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man in his 60s. But more importantly, the investigation had recovered over $7 million in stolen assets, providing substantial restitution to victims who had never expected to see their money again. Mrs. Phillips was able to move out of subsidized housing and into a comfortable apartment. Other victims were able to recover enough money to maintain their independence and dignity in their final years. And I had the satisfaction of knowing that my knowledge from a previous life had helped prevent another predator from destroying innocent families. By the time I graduated from Stanford with a degree in criminal justice, I had already been recruited by the FBI's white-collar crime division. My work on the Steinberg case had demonstrated both my analytical abilities and my intuitive understanding of how financial predators operate. I spent my first 2 years as a federal agent working on elder fraud cases, using the lessons I had learned from my previous life to identify and prosecute criminals who targeted vulnerable seniors. It was emotionally difficult work. Every case reminded me of my mother's suffering in that other timeline, but it was also deeply satisfying. I became known within the Bureau as someone who could spot financial predators before they completed their schemes. My success rate was unusually high, and my methods were studied by other agents trying to understand how I could identify criminal patterns so quickly. What they didn't know was that I had lived through victimization in ways that gave me insights no textbook could provide. I understood the psychology of both predators and victims because I had experienced the devastating aftermath of financial manipulation firsthand. During my 3rd year with the FBI, I was promoted to a supervisory role and given the opportunity to create a new task force focused on preventing elder financial abuse. Instead of just investigating crimes after they occurred, we would work proactively to identify and stop predators before they could victimize seniors. It was exactly the kind of work I had hoped to do when I decided to become a federal agent, using knowledge gained from trauma to prevent others from experiencing the same suffering. The task force was incredibly successful. In our first year of operation, we prevented an estimated $12 million in losses to elderly victims by identifying and prosecuting predators early in their criminal schemes. More importantly, we developed new training materials and awareness programs that helped seniors recognize and avoid financial scams. Every family that learned to ask the right questions, every senior who learned to verify claims before trusting financial advisors, represented another small victory against the kind of predators who had destroyed my family and my previous life. 10 years after Marcus Chen's conviction and 5 years after Steinberg's trial, I received a letter that reminded me why my work was so important. The letter was from Patricia Chen, Marcus's ex-wife, who had spent the years since his conviction working to rebuild her life and atone for her unwilling participation in his crimes. Dear Agent Morrison, she wrote, I wanted you to know that the nonprofit organization I started with the recovered asset money has now helped over 500 families avoid financial scams. We provide free education programs about investment fraud, and we've created a hotline where people can get advice about suspicious financial offers. And last month, we received a call from a retired teacher in Ohio who was being pressured by a financial advisor to invest her pension money in a guaranteed real estate development. The advisor was using exactly the same language and techniques that my ex-husband used. Because of our educational materials, she recognized the warning signs and contacted the FBI instead of giving him her money. I know I can never undo the harm that Marcus caused, but I hope that preventing even one family from experiencing what his victims went through makes some small difference. Thank you for helping to bring him to justice and for the work you continue to do protecting families from predators. The letter reminded me that justice isn't just about punishing criminals. It's about creating systems that protect innocent people from becoming victims in the first place. My work with the FBI had evolved beyond just investigating individual cases to developing policy recommendations for financial institutions, training programs for law enforcement, and educational materials for potential victims. Every system we created, every warning sign we publicized, every red flag we taught people to recognize represented another barrier between predators and their intended victims. But most importantly, I had learned that knowledge gained from suffering, whether in this life or a previous one, could be transformed into power to protect others. Marcus Chen remained in federal prison, where he would stay for at least another 15 years. Robert Steinberg had died in custody 3 years into his sentence, his crimes finally catching up with him in the form of a heart attack that no amount of stolen money could prevent. And I continued my work, armed with the hard-won wisdom that sometimes the universe gives you exactly the knowledge you need to prevent others from experiencing the same pain you endured. In my previous life, I had been powerless to protect my family from financial predators. In this life, I had used that experience to become someone who could protect hundreds of families from the same fate. It wasn't the life I had originally planned, but it was exactly the life I was meant to live.